Good morning. Thank you for coming out on a Saturday morning. Si ocupan traducción, hay aparatos en la entrada. Today is all about teaching anti-corruption. There are many ways to interest the new generation in corruption. Often it's our own personal experiences. In my case, what got me interested as a scholar in corruption was a single article that was included on a reading list in one of my courses in graduate school. It was a course on economic history, and one of the readings was the now classic article by Schleifer and Vishny called Corruption. And I became aware that corruption could be studied as an economic phenomenon. And after that, all of my final papers were on corruption. My thesis was going to be on corruption. It was that one paper that got me interested. So the open sessions today will be focusing on courses that teach corruption and how we get our students involved, especially in places where corruption isn't generally considered a problem, but also in places where corruption is a problem, how do you convince students that we can actually do something about it? So we're going to start with Matthew Stevenson, who's going to talk more generally about corruption and how we study it and where we study it, and a little bit about how it fits into the educational system. Thanks, Matthew.
All right, good morning, everybody. It's great to see you all here on a lovely Saturday morning. Before we get started, I want to just first thank Bonnie in particular for putting this event together and for this institution for hosting it, and to all of you for coming out to participate in the event. I really am thrilled, actually, that Bonnie and her institution took the initiative to organize a conference for academics studying corruption in the Americas, from the Americas. I think it's really important, actually, to advance our research on this very important topic to strengthen these networks of academics and academic researchers. I think this is how we learn from each other. This is how we shape our research agendas. This is how collaborations emerge. This is how we figure out how we're going to approach teaching the topic, and it's great. I mean, Bonnie and I met through a UN-sponsored program to promote the teaching of anti-corruption at the university level. And while I think we both admire the work that the UN and similar organizations are doing, I think sometimes those organizations are a bit too focused on creating online resources or physical documents or products that they think will help support teaching and research in this area. But I think it's very clear that it's really the human interaction and the face-to-face meetings and contacts that are most critical for moving this forward. And there's only so much you can do in any one country. And so I think it's really great that Bonnie and this institution have taken the initiative to organize what I hope will not be the last, but rather the first organization of this kind to build these networks of academics. I really think it's absolutely crucially important. So because the focus of this meeting really is on academic researchers, my remarks this morning are principally devoted to those among us who are doing academic research in the area of corruption and anti-corruption. Just out of curiosity, someone did this yesterday for a slightly different purpose. By show of hands, how many of you in the audience are kind of academic researchers focused on corruption, either professors or graduate students who are in that area? Okay, so actually less than a majority, which was not what I was expecting, but fine. My remarks are for those of you who just raised your hands. And those of you in the room are friends from civil society or business or government or whatever. feel free to listen, and maybe something in this will be of interest, but this is not really for you. This is really in the spirit of getting academics together to talk about the things that we do. This is going to be kind of an insider chat from one academic to other academics with thoughts about the research agenda in anti-corruption. I may have a little bit to say near the end of my remarks about other issues, including teaching, but I really want to talk a little bit about the broader research agenda in anti-corruption and where it's going. And I think that, when thinking about this issue, I'm reminded of a line attributed to the Nobel laureate economist James Tobin, who said, "The most important decisions a scholar makes are what problems to work on." And you could apply this to the decision to work on anti-corruption as opposed to any number of other topics, but even within the topic of anti-corruption, all of us who are doing academic research make choices about which particular problems or questions we want to devote our limited time and attention to, and which ones we think we're going to put to the side and not focus on. So, in that spirit, I want to offer a series of remarks which are maybe deliberately provocative to a certain extent with my own thoughts, just my own personal, maybe idiosyncratic opinions, about a bunch of things that I think actually we shouldn't spend too much time on and that I would urge you to not pursue. And then after that list, I'll maybe offer some thoughts about lines of research or scholarly inquiry that I think we need more people working on. So my, again, perhaps deliberately provocative list of things that I think we should avoid as part of the anti-corruption research agenda. Thing number one, definitions and conceptualization. What is corruption? How do we define corruption? What is our concept of corruption? So this question strikes me as a swamp in which many scholars get stuck and never emerge. I kind of feel like in general, we academics, when we run out of ideas, we start arguing about definitions. It's kind of a sign that a scholarly research agenda is not going anywhere. It's not that there aren't interesting, important, hard questions about the definition of corruption. It's not that the definition of corruption isn't important. But people have already had that conversation, right? There's dozens of articles going back for decades about working through, well, what is corruption? How do we define it? What are the ambiguities in the definition? As far as I'm concerned, there's really nothing new to say about that topic. And I don't think actually our major challenges in making progress on this topic are that people haven't defined the term precisely enough. It's a kind of an imprecise term with vague boundaries. Many of the terms we use in social science research are imprecise terms with vague boundaries. What's a city? What's a war? I mean, you can argue, you can quibble about where the boundaries of those terms are, but people can still proceed to study urbanization, can proceed to study war without having entire conferences get swallowed up by the question of how do we define the term. So I would urge all of you, especially those of you who are younger scholars, junior professors or advanced graduate students, to avoid the attraction of getting sucked into the definitional debates from which you will never emerge. Just come up with a working definition for purposes of your own work and proceed. Second thing, I think we need not to spend quite as much time on it. It's not because it's not important, but what someone I know once derisively described as admiring the problem. So corruption is bad. It's important as a general matter to have research investigating the negative consequences of corruption. So again, this is not an argument that these things aren't important, but it's been done, right? We've got now 30 years of research, much of which has concentrated on the adverse effects of corruption, most of it on the adverse economic effects of corruption, but plenty on the adverse political and social effects of corruption. This is particularly true of macro-level effects, like the relationship between corruption and economic growth, the relationship between corruption and health outcomes, and so forth. So, again, I would advise young scholars in particular not to make that the emphasis of your research, not because it's not important, but because, to use the economic language, the marginal benefit, the marginal value added of one more paper showing that corruption has negative economic effects is at this point fairly low. You can go through the existing papers if you want and synthesize them and present them in a way that might be useful to the advocacy community, for example. But there's plenty of that. I think we don't need that much more. There are exceptions to every rule. I've seen actually a couple of really good papers recently that demonstrate adverse impacts of corruption in places that are maybe a little bit more surprising or more indirect. So there can be progress made in this area, but if I was going to offer kind of a general rule of thumb, it would be to not place so much emphasis in your academic research agenda on documenting corruption's adverse effects, at least at the macro level. Third thing, kind of related. So a lot of the research on corruption over the last 20 to 30 years has involved cross-national quantitative regressions using measures like the Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index. Some people are very critical of this whole line of research. I'm not one of those people. I think this line of research has actually been really useful. I think finding a lot of those correlations in the cross-national macro-level data has been really, really helpful. But this is another area where I'm skeptical where there's that much more to be gained from yet another paper doing a cross-country regression where the corruption perceptions index is either the explanatory variable or the outcome variable, just because there are like 200 papers that do this, trying to find the correlation with every other cross-national data set under the sun, whether it's democracy or economics or entrepreneurship or internet penetration or telecommunications or news media or whatever. And I feel like we've squeezed as much blood out of that particular turnip as it is possible to squeeze. I don't know how that will translate, actually, for those of you who are listening in Spanish, just an English colloquial expression. And I feel like, again, for young researchers, this is excessively attractive because the data is right there. It seems relatively straightforward to go into Stata or your favorite statistical program and you have the CPI data and you can get other data and you can run some regressions. But at this point, the odds that the 201st paper that does something like that is going to discover something genuinely new that the first 200 papers doing something like this haven't discovered is relatively low. I also think one of the ways people try to get around this is by using fancier and fancier statistical techniques to try to squeeze some kind of new information out of this cross-national data. And I got to say, I'm really skeptical. I think that there's only so much you can do with kind of noisy, imperfect data. And fancier algorithms that are more and more opaque to the average reader in terms of what you're doing, I think, are not actually all that helpful. I have a whole rant that I could go on about bad instrumental variable analysis, but scanning the crowd, I'm not sure how many people in here are that deep into the statistics to care. I'll just say that for those of you who are not stat people, whenever you read a paper saying, it's difficult to work out the causality, but we use an instrumental variable to figure it out, disbelieve the paper, because in the entire corruption literature, all the instrumental variables that people use are just bad. And if you see a paper that does that, just throw it in the garbage, because it probably means the author doesn't really know what he or she is doing. I told you I was going to be provocative, and I'll stick to those guns if I need to. Next issue, and again here I'm going to be deliberately provocative, there's been some interest in the last 10, 15 years in lab experiments in corruption, which typically involve getting undergraduates to play games where they pretend to give each other bribes and get relatively small amounts of real money. I was initially not as skeptical of this line of research as many of my traditional economics-oriented colleagues, but having spent a fair amount of time reading, I think probably the majority of papers that have come out of lab experiments in corruption, I've actually become kind of skeptical that this is really a very good use of time and resources, mainly because of what the jargon would refer to as the external validity problem. I read a lot of these papers and it said we had these students play these games and here's the bar graphs for how many chose to give a bribe or how many didn't, and I just don't know what to do with it. I feel like 10 years of research along those lines hasn't produced anything that I would recognize as kind of a cumulative, reliable indicator of human behavior that's especially useful. So I'm not so fond of lab experiments, and I feel like they're very time-consuming, they're relatively expensive. I'm not sure that in this particular field they're terribly useful. And the last thing I'll say, and this is mostly to my colleagues who are in law schools or who teach in law schools, I feel like papers that are principally doctrinal descriptions are not that helpful. I feel like I read a fair amount of papers about anti-corruption law that are essentially summaries of what the law is, and I kind of don't know what to do with these papers, right? These are things that people who are not academics can look up if they need to look them up, and I feel like those of us who work in the legal field need to do something more than that. And so what might that be? Well, having been very negative, let me now shift gears and try to be a little bit more positive and constructive by emphasizing some things that I think we need more of, directions that I really hope more young scholars will go in terms of doing important work on anti-corruption. The first thing we need more of is just comprehensive and critical synthesis of the existing work on corruption. This is something that's of personal interest to me because it's what I've been trying to at least start doing over the past couple of years. But since the serious academic research on corruption kicked off, I want to say in about the mid-1990s. There was important work before then. Susan Rose Ackerman's book was from the late 1970s. Political scientist James Scott did important work on corruption in the 60s and 70s. There was stuff before then, but in terms of the explosion of research on anti-corruption, it really starts in the mid-1990s. And at this point, there's so much of it that no person with a real day job working in the world in government or advocacy or anything could possibly go through it and figure out what we've learned from it. And I feel like we as academics collectively in this field have not done a terribly good job in synthesizing the body of knowledge that we have produced. And this is in part because the career rewards, especially as an untenured scholar for synthesis work, are not very high. Everyone wants to make their own original contribution, and I respect that. So those of you who don't have tenure yet, by all means, don't do what I'm about to describe. But those of you who have a little bit more job security, I feel like we would be doing the world a service if we spent a little bit more time going through carefully and critically and figure out what we've learned from past work. And that means not just reading the abstract and summarizing it, because a lot of the past work, again, being provocative, is really bad. I spend a lot of my time reading the anti-corruption literature. I read a lot of papers that have abstracts that make it look like they find some really important dramatic finding. And if you actually read the paper carefully, I'm trying to figure out if I should use a euphemism or if I should use very strong language. I'll go with euphemism. Unsatisfying. And I think that we do the world and our friends in the civil society and government communities in this room a disservice if we don't do enough critical review of the existing scholarship to figure out what's good and what's bad and what do we actually know about corruption's causes, consequences, and possible solutions. Second thing that I really think we need more focus on, and I suspect my friends in the NGOs and government here would likely agree with this, is more emphasis on responses to corruption, possible solutions to corruption, what we know about what works and what doesn't work. Again, I think that the research community has done an excellent job in documenting that corruption is a problem. We have 20 to 30 years of research that I think, despite all the problems in that literature, shows fairly conclusively that while we can debate how big a problem it is, it's a problem. I don't think we actually, again, the marginal value added of documenting that it's a problem at this point is not very high. The research on what we can do about that problem is considerably thinner and less satisfying. Partly because that question is much harder to answer with the available tools and the available data that we've got. But that's where there are significant marginal gains to be made, both in terms of intellectual understanding and in terms of assisting the people out there in the world who really need our help. There are two aspects, I think, of the how do we solve the corruption problem issue that are related, but I want to think about separately. One is what you can think of as the technology of corruption reduction. And by technology here, I'm using that word very broadly and generally. I don't mean specifically, for example, computer technology or cell phones. I just mean the tools that we can use. So there's a question about more academic research figuring out what anti-corruption tools are effective. The second issue has to do with the politics of anti-corruption reform, the conditions under which governments will adopt and implement and maintain commitment to whatever that set of tools happens to be that can reduce corruption. I think that we would do the world a great service if we did more research that provided better evidence both on the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of different potential tools that could be used to combat corruption, and also contributed to a better understanding of the circumstances under which those tools will actually be used in an effective way. So let me say a little bit about each of those things and maybe some directions our research efforts could go that would be helpful. So with respect to the tools and technology, so for the social science types in the room, I feel like we need to get a little bit more micro, more within-country studies doing assessments of particular interventions to figure out whether they were effective or not. Again, this is not because I think the macro-level evidence is not useful, but that's kind of been done. Everything we can learn at this point, I shouldn't say everything, almost everything we can learn from the macro-level cross-country data in terms of the effectiveness of various anti-corruption strategies, I think we've kind of gotten. And to make more progress, I think there need to be many more studies that look at particular interventions in particular countries and that can assess in a relatively rigorous way what their impact was. So one way forward on this is the expanded use of randomized control trials. Well, there's been a lot of enthusiasm in the development economics community generally for randomized trials at this point. I think there can be more of them. Some of the most important work that's been done on anti-corruption specifically recently has used randomized trials. Randomized trials are challenging. They're very expensive. They raise, in some circumstances, ethical issues. They require usually the cooperation of governments in the country or jurisdiction of interest. So they can be very challenging. I don't think that they are the be-all, end-all of anti-corruption research, the way that some of their proponents sometimes suggest. But I do think that the potential for gains in understanding from randomizing anti-corruption interventions and then studying the results are very high. In order to do these effectively, there really does need to be collaboration. These are, I think, inevitably collaborative enterprises between researchers with the appropriate economics and statistical tools, people who have the right local contacts with governments or NGOs. They really are collaborative, and which is one of the reasons I think it's great that groups like this are starting to bring people from different disciplinary traditions together. And I would encourage folks out there to think about where there might be opportunities to use randomized experiments or to take advantage of genuine randomization in the world to learn something about the effectiveness of various sorts of anti-corruption interventions. When randomized trials are not available, sort of the second best option are natural experiments, where just by happenstance, you get something close to a randomized treatment in the world, even though it wasn't planned by an experimenter. A lot of really interesting, important work, I think, has been generated by this sort of research as well. This is another place where you need probably collaboration, or at the very least, deep interdisciplinary knowledge, because to identify appropriate random or natural experiments, you got to really know the particular country or jurisdiction really well, the details of its policy and how they are implemented. And you also have to have the social scientist's mind or intuition to be able to spot places where there's actually an experiment. So this is another place where I think it would be great to have more collaboration between country experts or area experts or people who have expertise in particular policy implementation issues and those who do social science research design to find more opportunities to collaborate, to leverage natural experiments that exist in the world that can be used to generate useful information about how best to fight corruption. Another promising way forward, I know this has gotten a lot of attention recently, is the analysis of so-called big data. This is not always possible in the corruption area, but in some places it may be. So procurement, to pick up on a couple of papers that we had yesterday, is one area. There's some researchers in Europe, for example, who have taken advantage of the fact that in many European countries, not just in wealthy northwestern Europe, but in Central and Eastern Europe as well, public contracts are all in a giant database, and it's possible to use algorithms generated by theory, not just kind of random data mining, but theoretically grounded algorithms to spot contracts that should raise red flags or to test hypotheses about corrupt networks and so forth. So I think there's a lot of promise there. Procurement data is probably the most obvious. There may be others as well, other places where we can use analysis of existing data to identify patterns that will help us better understand where corruption risks are highest and what we can do to reduce them. For my friends in law, I said a moment ago that I think it's not so helpful to spend a lot of our research energy doing doctrinal description, especially the anti-corruption laws. What I think would be much more helpful is to focus more specifically on research on the enforcement system, issues related to things like procedure, burdens of proof, liability of legal persons, various other things like that, and understand the incentive effects they create and their broader consequences. So that we can and often in ways that go far beyond corruption per se, but to better understand how the overall operation of the legal system can make anti-corruption laws either effective or ineffective in practice. And I emphasize this because there are many countries in the world that have anti-corruption laws on paper that are fairly similar and look pretty good if you just look at the laws on paper. But in practice, the enforcement is very, very different. And this might be possibly due to different levels of commitment by the authorities to enforce the laws effectively. But as lawyers and legal scholars often recognize, it often has to do with the way the law generally is structured. So we talked a lot about Brazil and Lava Jato yesterday, the car wash investigation. So the new anti-corruption laws enacted in around 2011, 2012 made a difference, but I gather from my Brazilian friends that it also made a really big difference that the Brazilian authorities were able to make better use of leniency agreements, particularly with legal entities as well as people. In France, the alterations to the substantive anti-corruption law, I think many legal scholars believe will make much less of a difference than more recent procedural changes to the criminal law, especially related to corporate criminal liability, the so-called loi Sapin II. So I think that this is one place where legal scholars actually have a comparative advantage relative to their brothers and sisters in social sciences, because oftentimes those of us who work in social sciences, our understanding of the law is maybe not that sophisticated, and we might not necessarily understand the way these subtle differences in legal procedure can lead to significant differences in the way laws are implemented in the world. That's a place where I think the law professors have a real comparative advantage, and more work along those lines, again, that's not restricted to just description or doctrinal analysis, but that tries to work out the incentive effects of different legal structures would be extremely useful. One other thing that I think we could use a lot more attention to that goes beyond corruption per se, but where I really feel that there's a weakness or a gap in the literature generally and in my own understanding, and that has to do with issues related to finance, money laundering, anonymous companies, corporate structures, and so forth. We talked a little bit yesterday in the conversation about how much of the research has been on so-called petty corruption. I share the misgivings about the use of that terminology. We might think of as bureaucratic corruption or lower-level bribery. For grand corruption issues, I think there's been increasing recognition that to really deal with those issues effectively, you've got to follow the money, and you've got to figure out how to seize it and freeze it and what the rules should be for things like civil asset forfeiture, asset return, to better understand the strategies that the bad guys use to hide and launder their money. And in just reading the academic literature, it's possible that I've missed a lot of important work, but I feel like that the work on corruption, traditional corruption, bribery, and so forth, is much stronger than the research on money laundering, asset seizures, asset forfeiture, hiding the money, and so forth. And so I think that for those of you, again, the young up-and-coming scholars, if you're looking for places where your work can maybe make a greater marginal difference to our understanding of the problem and what to do about it, I would encourage you to learn more about issues related to corporate secrecy, money laundering, finance, and so forth. I certainly feel that my understanding of these issues is not as strong as my understanding of other issues in the anti-corruption area, and I've increasingly recognized that impedes my ability to really move my own thinking forward on how to respond to the corruption problem. So unsolicited advice may be worth what you paid for it, which is not essentially nothing, but keep that in mind. So the last thing that I'll mention, let me shift gears from kind of the tools or technology of anti-corruption to the politics of anti-corruption reform. I actually think this is the big issue. Susan mentioned this yesterday in her keynote remarks for those of you who were there. It's come up a little bit otherwise. But I actually think, despite everything that I just said about better understanding kind of what works in terms of fighting corruption, I think we basically know. I feel like for the last 100 years, maybe longer, we know basically what you need to do if you want to get corruption under control. We can quibble at the margins, but you need effective enforcement by investigative and prosecutorial bodies that have sufficient independence, autonomy, and resources to take it seriously. The laws on the books have to be adequate. You need to have auditing of government programs. You need to have the appropriate combination of transparency and accountability. We know all this. There's always more to learn. But I feel like the big challenge in getting corruption under control, if we ask the question, why is it that so many countries, including this one, including many throughout the Americas and throughout the world, haven't gotten corruption under control, I'm pretty sure it's not because we haven't yet figured out the tools that work. Again, we can always learn more about which tools are most effective, but that's not the big issue. The big issue is figuring out the conditions under which governments will actually commit to use those tools in a sustained way, even in situations when it is politically difficult to do so. That's the issue. That issue, my reading of the existing anti-corruption literature in the academic world, is one that is extremely poorly understood. I have back in my office, I collect all this literature, and because I'm old-fashioned, I get printouts of it, and I have it actually in physical file boxes in my office. So the file boxes on evidence showing negative economic impacts of corruption takes up, I think, 4 or 5 file boxes along my wall, and they're stuffed, so it's hard to get the folders in and out. I've got another file box that's research on the conditions under which anti-corruption reforms will be successful or unsuccessful, the political factors and others. That's like half of one file box, and most of what's actually in that file box is not very good. I feel like that is a place where we really need more work and better understanding. Often when you see discussions of this issue, you see this phrase, political will, which I think is kind of a cop-out. Right? There's a discussion, here are the anti-corruption reforms we need. Why did it fail in this country or that country? Because there was lack of political will. Well, that doesn't really answer the question. That just re-describes the problem. The question for which we need much better answers is under what conditions do we see this so-called political will emerging? What are the most effective strategies for those who care about fighting corruption for creating or maintaining that political will? And here I feel like we as academics have collectively not yet done a terribly good job in solving that problem. Now, it may be because that's an extraordinarily difficult problem to solve, right? The first and second generations of anti-corruption researchers kind of got the easy problems, right? They're like, hey, we've got this data on corruption perceptions, we've got this data on, press freedom. Let's correlate that. Let's see if there's a correlation. So for you guys, you young folks in the audience, it's too late for you, right? The easy stuff, the first and second generation, they already got. So now we're on to the hard problem, and the hard problem is the political problem, understanding the politics of anti-corruption reform. So if you want a big and important problem to work on as an academic, where not even if you solve it, if you help make even a bit of progress on that, you will have made a substantial contribution not only to our understanding as academics, but to the people in the world who work on this issue. That's the issue. So please, go forth and work on that issue. It would be an extraordinary, extraordinary help. So that's mainly what I had to say about my thoughts on sort of addressing Professor Tobin's challenge to all of us as academics. How should we pick what topics or problems we want to work on? Let me just say, because the theme of today is teaching, let me just say one word about that that's only sort of connected with the main bulk of my remarks, but I wanted to put it on the table because I think it often comes up in discussions of how we do anti-corruption teaching. And that has to do with how we conceive of what our objective is when we offer a university-level course on corruption, anti-corruption. Broadly speaking, when I've encountered people out there in the world who talk about this issue, there are two main objectives that people often have in mind, which are not necessarily inconsistent, but which are different and can at least sometimes be in tension with one another. First, some university-level courses on corruption are essentially courses where we try to understand the phenomenon as a social scientist or an observer, where the objective of the course is to cultivate critical thinking skills, to learn to analyze data, to understand the phenomenon as a phenomenon. And in these classes, our students and we may be motivated by the fact that we think corruption is a big problem in the world, but the objective of the course is not really to influence students' values or to convince them that it's a problem. Rather, we treat corruption as an object of study. Again, it may be motivated by the idea that it is a problem in the world, and if we better understand it, eventually there will be better responses to it. But courses like that are about understanding. And our learning objectives for our students have to do with critical thinking skills, research skills, and so forth. When I approach teaching anti-corruption, that's kind of the way I think about it. I'll let Bonnie speak for herself during her presentation, but I've seen her present on her course materials in the past, and they have that flavor as well. But there's another approach to university-level anti-corruption education, which I've encountered, which is really about shaping students' values. I didn't fully appreciate this until I started to participate in more international meetings when I would speak with other professors from other parts of the world who very much had the idea that why do we teach anti-corruption courses in universities? It's to get the message across to our students that corruption is bad, that it's hurting the society, that they shouldn't be corrupt, and they should take action to fight corruption. That's more what I think of as like the evangelistic or proselytizing mission of a university-level anti-corruption course. And I don't mean to use those terms in a pejorative sense, but there is this idea out there that a university classroom can be an opportunity to shape students' values, not just to teach them about corruption as a problem, but to help solve the problem of corruption by affecting our students' attitudes, especially when those students are likely to be members of the elite stratum of society. I will confess that I'm not completely comfortable with that way of thinking about anti-corruption education. It's partly because my own background, it's not what I'm used to, and I recognize that. It's partly because I'm a bit skeptical that by the time you get people in university, you as a professor have very much capacity to shape their values. I get students between roughly the ages of 23 and 27, and I'm not terribly convinced that there's much I can do to change their broader attitudes. But the main point I want to make here is not to argue for one or the other of these being better. It's just to highlight, as a preface to the rest of today's session, which we'll spend a lot of time thinking about teaching, that these are different ways of conceiving of our mission and role in the classroom. And I think it's useful for us to be conscious of and self-conscious about these different understandings of what our role as instructors might be. Are we trying to help students think critically and analytically about a social phenomenon in the world? Are we trying to shape their values and attitudes towards that social phenomenon in the world? They're not the same. The final thing I'll say, since most of my talk has been, again, very much an insider talk directed at those of you in the audience who, like me, are academic researchers, but since we do have many friends in the audience from civil society, the non-governmental community, and others, let me just say in closing just a little bit that's directed at you guys. We'd love to talk to you. One of the things that's really nice about anti-corruption as a field compared to other fields that I've studied is there really does seem to be much more interest on the government and civil society side in academic research and what academics have to say, which is great. I would also advise those of you in the outside the academic world to be critical and careful, but hopefully enthusiastic consumers of academic work. Again, not all of it is good. Be cautious of very strong claims. Whenever anyone says that a certain thing about corruption has been proven to be the case, be skeptical. But continue to be engaged, and let us know what you need. Not so much for your advocacy mission. Again, I know a lot of times people will say we need to be able to convince policymakers that corruption is bad. Can you please give us papers showing corruption is bad? I get that. What I would say to that is it already exists, so what we need to do as academics is package it in a way that's more accessible. What I really have in mind, though, is it would be very useful to hear from people who work on these issues in the world, where are the holes, where are the gaps? Not where do you need additional material to convince people, but where do you feel like there's something that you really don't understand, or where in shaping your advocacy mission, you're kind of not sure what to advocate for because you need more information? That's the kind of thing where I've offered in my opening remarks today my own thoughts about where I think the gaps are, where the holes are, where I think the high priority topics for research ought to be. But this is a collaborative enterprise, not only across academics, but between academics and others in the anti-corruption world who work on these issues. And speaking as an academic, it would be very useful for me to be able to continue to engage with those of you out in the world who are consumers of academic work to better understand what types of research would have the greatest value for you in the work that you are doing. Not that I'm going to set my academic research agenda based on what some external client tells me I should do. None of us should do that. But I think it's really important to have that information so that we can all, again, do our best to take Professor Tobin's advice to heart and think very carefully about what topics we want to work on, because as scholars, those are the most important decisions we make. And I should say, I'm happy to, I don't know how much time we have, I'm happy to do questions or conversation or interactions, totally up to you. Okay. Oh, great.
And thank you. My introduction was terrible. I just want to point out Matthew Stevenson is from Harvard University, and for those of you who are not familiar with it, he also is the editor of the Global Anti-Corruption blog, and I would recommend that you look that up. Very interesting short articles on corruption throughout the world.
Thank
Questions?
you very much. Please.
It's not a question. Like, I want to open the conversation
Great.
about some remarks you did.
Yep.
I'm Ana Cabrera. I work at this NGO that promotes culture of lawfulness, but I'm also a researcher, social sciences researcher. Sorry. So what you're talking about, this academic call to action, I think that's like a very old debate about how academics, do they have this responsibility to get involved in what happens in society, or is just their responsibility is just being observers and analyze things. Like I've had this debate like very young, because when I started my PhD, something terrible happened here. Like they killed 2 students, and so we as researchers, like all my fellow mates, we were like, okay, we're studying social movements and we're studying social phenomenon. Should we get involved, like take the streets, or just observe while they're killing our own people? So yeah, it's like a very difficult debate. I think it's up to each person. Like if you really have this, you want to come forward to raise the hand and say that you don't agree, or you agree and then take the streets, or just from your desk try to do something. And also about this collaboration, I think it's totally necessary. Yesterday I was kind of overwhelmed because now that I work at this NGO and I do the trainings, like I get each month and a half, I get in this room with 15, 20 people of different organizations, business, other NGOs, universities, schools. I get them in this classroom from 4 to 8 hours in a culture of lawfulness training. So I get a lot of data. Probably not quantitative data, but they share a lot. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to systematize all of this, because I think it's worth it. Like, yeah, I don't know why. I have a lot of data, or I can, I've got, in the operation, it's complicated to to register everything, to record everything, but we have it. We'd like to systematize data, and also we have a project that tries to systematize it, or the cases in some companies where we've been working. So that we'd love to do it, and also I share what you've said, like about the micro action or thing we have to look at. For example, I try to motivate people to act not corrupt. So I have to, like, just by empirical, just by experience, I've come to some insights on how to do it, but I don't have like any formal research to back that, or to get some more ideas about how to motivate people to not to be corrupt. Mm-hmm. So that's a gap we have to work on.
Okay.
And that's it. Thank you.
Buenos días. Me gustaría formular la pregunta en español, por favor.
Hold on a second.
Sí. Sí, Matthew, agradecerte tu intervención y preguntarte, yo soy profesor de Derecho en la Universidad de Monterrey, mi nombre es Samuel, y quisiera preguntarte si ves en estos consejos que nos das el enfoque de derechos humanos como un área, digamos, de oportunidad para investigación. Recientemente, en 2015, el Consejo de Derechos Humanos de Naciones Unidas emitió un informe de expertos con relación a las consecuencias negativas de la corrupción en el disfrute de los derechos humanos, y hace apenas un par de meses la Corte Interamericana de Derechos Humanos, en el caso de Ramírez Escobar contra Guatemala, determinó que justamente pues estos contextos de corrupción fomentan la violación de derechos humanos. Este caso fue de adopciones internacionales de niños guatemaltecos y cómo se genera un mercado ilegal justamente para afectar estos derechos a la familia, a las garantías judiciales, etc. ¿Tú considerarías que este enfoque, digamos, es algo que sería importante, una línea, digamos, de investigación a desarrollar particularmente en los países de América Latina?
Thanks very much. I'll respond in English since I can't respond in Spanish. So the question, as I understand it, is would I think it's an important topic for academics to research the relationship between corruption and human rights? And my response to that would be, at a general level, yes, but I think certain aspects of that link are maybe more important to investigate carefully than are others. I think that it is less important at this stage to establish as a general matter a negative correlation between corruption at the country level and human rights defined at a very broad level, using general international indexes. Not because that correlation is not important to understand, but because, as I said in my talk, we've already got a lot that's basically been done. So at this point, I feel like we're on pretty solid ground with that understanding. Where I think there is important opportunity for progress on a couple of fronts. One would be seeing, in the context of a lawyer or a law professor, seeing if there are ways to establish particular kinds of corruption as leading to particular sorts of human rights violations that would enable actors within the legal system to take legal action to seek remedies for those human rights violations. That is, better understanding not just the kind of macro association between corruption and human rights violations, but figuring out whether there are plausible legal theories that would allow those who have suffered human rights violations that are due to corruption to seek redress. That'll be one thing. Second thing that I think is actually a really important area for academic research would be to better understand whether the human rights apparatus, the institutions, treaties, courts, etc., are or are not an effective means for redressing corruption issues. So if there's a question as a matter of legal or political strategy, do we want to link corruption to human rights? Do we want to use the human rights institutions as the forum for which we will seek redress for these kinds of corruption issues? Whether that's a viable strategy, right? Whether these institutions are actually effective. We can't just take for granted that these institutions will be effective. We would need to consider carefully whether they work, and we would need to consider whether incorporating corruption actually adds something or increases the potential that they will be effective. Another issue that's very closely related but somewhat different, where I think we could use more research and understanding, is to figure out whether, as a matter of political strategy or rhetorical framing corruption as a human rights issue is likely to increase public or political support for fighting corruption or not. My personal experience is that when I have engaged with academics and activists who come primarily out of the human rights tradition, there is a strong assumption that framing an issue as a human rights issue increases that issue's importance and the degree to which other actors in the world will view it as important. My own experience, perhaps because I spent a considerable amount of time in China and elsewhere in East and Southeast Asia, has led me to have some skepticism about whether that's in fact true. When I engage with my Chinese students on this question, for example, in my anti-corruption class that I teach in China, they, who tend to be very committed to anti-corruption, and many of whom also actually care a lot about human rights, say, oh gosh, don't link these issues if you want to help move the fight against corruption forward in China, because there, if you call something a human rights issue, it sets off all sorts of red flags that this is all about imposing alien values or trying to undermine our government. My own view is agnostic. This is why I say this is an important issue to research. I haven't actually seen any serious, careful research. And it could be done. I said some things about lab experiments before that were critical, but here you could imagine, actually, as I'm speaking, I'm just kind of making this up, but you could imagine a lab experiment that would look at how different framings of a corruption issue affected people's response to it, and whether framing corruption as a human rights violation increased or decreased people's sense of its importance, universality, willingness to take on, and so forth. Maybe that's a stupid idea. Again, I'm just kind of making it up off the top of my head, but this is why the answer to your question is complicated, right? That's another issue where I feel like more academic research would certainly be useful, because those of you out there in the world who are engaged in either political advocacy or legal strategy might want to know, is this going to help or hurt my legal case in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, for example, if I try to bring in corruption? Is this going to help or hurt my advocacy strategy if I try to frame corruption as a human rights issue? And we as academics maybe haven't done the best job providing answers to those questions. Now, I'm careful to say this. I know we have another presentation coming up this afternoon specifically on corruption and human rights, and if anything I'm saying is wrong and there's in fact an extensive literature on this question, I would be thrilled to be corrected on that. But that is my sense of where it can be helpful. So again, at a broad level, saying there's an association between corruption and human rights violations, I'm not sure. It's important to teach that. It's important to get that message out, maybe. As an area for academic research, again, that's kind of been done, but these other issues, I don't think really, to my knowledge, have been investigated as thoroughly or as rigorously, and that's a place where I think we as academics can make a difference. And let me actually use, and I know I've talked probably for too long on this question, but let me use that to link this to the previous comment about the tension that we feel as academics between our desire to solve a problem, right? Many of us got attracted to the corruption issue because we view it as a problem, we want to solve it, and the idea that as academics we should be dispassionate and critical and as objective as we can be. I completely agree these things are often in tension, but sometimes they are linked. Sometimes as academics, our value added, our comparative advantage to the larger struggle is our ability to step back a little bit and be more dispassionate and critical, to make sure that what our instincts might tell us is the most effective advocacy strategy is actually true, right? So I think that in investigating, we might think very strongly corruption is a human rights violation, but one thing academics can add is to have a little bit of a critical perspective on that. The academics, I think, one of the things we're good at is stepping back and saying, wait, people generally believe this thing. Is it actually true? What's the evidence that it's actually true? How strong is that evidence? Where can we find weak spots and push on it? And that can be, sometimes as an academic, that can be a little bit frustrating. Like you don't feel like you're actually out there helping the cause as much. And I agree with that. And sometimes you do have to be out in the streets in a moment of crisis. But I actually think that distancing of yourself from a problem, even the one you care about, is often our comparative advantage. Because if it turns out that something that we believe, that our community believed is true, is maybe not as true as we thought, that can actually help us improve our strategy overall. I don't know who's calling on, I don't know who gets to pick the question, so you do it.
La pregunta es en español.
Hold on just a moment.
¿Puede ser factible el crear un modelo educativo en el que desde preescolar, primaria y secundaria se formen valores y tengan cursos anticorrupción los niños para que no caigan en la corrupción? O sea, crear un modelo educativo en el desde que entras a estudiar puedas ir formándote en este tema y que de alguna manera gradualmente la corrupción se determine.
I'm going to give a very professor-like answer to that question, that I'm going to say yes and no, right? Sí y no, or something like that. And here's why. So can we try to teach values in the educational system? Yes, we can, and yes, we do. Not every educational system is focused specifically on anti-corruption, but every one of which I'm aware tries to teach kids basic stuff like play fair, don't cheat, respect your classmates, respect your teachers. I can certainly see value to integrating more kind of anti-corruption messaging in those classes in an age-appropriate way. And there have actually been many efforts in different parts of the world to do this. Not necessarily a full, comprehensive preschool through college systematic program. I think it may be unrealistic to expect that, unless you're in some kind of dictatorship, that you'd be able to do that in a really comprehensive way. But these kinds of things do exist. Let me say two things about that, though, which make me feel like, although I'm sympathetic, I would be a little bit hesitant to kind of say that's the way forward. The first thing is that, to the best of my knowledge, we don't yet have any research suggesting whether this actually works. That's another area, actually, where some of these research techniques I was describing could be really useful. It's difficult if you want to make long-term changes. It would be hard to do a randomized control trial on 4-year-olds and then wait 20 years to see what their attitudes were when they were university graduates. It would be doable. The question we would need to ask ourselves is it worth it given the investment of resources? We do studies like this with things like heart disease, where we follow people for 30 years. I'd be a little bit skeptical that most people would consider it kind of cost-effective. But there are other things you could do. I mean, you could randomize where one 5th grade class gets the usual curriculum and another one has anti-corruption integrated into it, and then maybe you could have them play some games at the end of the year where it's possible to cheat, and they kind of don't realize that it's possible, and they don't realize they're being experimented on, and you could just figure out where the ones who got the anti-corruption message cheated more or not. Again, I'm just kind of making up research designs as we go. That actually might be really useful, right? If you did that as a preliminary experiment and got big effects, then that might justify devoting more resources. If you did things like that and got no effect, well, then that wouldn't be dispositive. One experiment is just one experiment. But if you did a bunch of these things and consistently weren't getting any effects, right? If your anti-corruption curriculum didn't seem to be making any difference in measured levels of honesty, then you might want to rethink it. The second thing that I'll say actually relates to issues that came up in conversation yesterday. I think Susan in particular emphasized this, and I will too. I agree completely that changing values and attitudes is an important part of the struggle against corruption. But it's not the only thing you can do, because a lot of times people engage in corruption because it is in fact the rational thing to do under the circumstances. I don't think it's that helpful to tell people from the time they're young, whatever you do, don't cheat, don't break the rules, don't pay bribes, whatever, and then throw them out into an adult world where you can't get ahead, you can't get the kinds of life that you want for you and your family unless you cheat and break the rules and pay bribes and so forth. Especially, I actually think for teenagers and university students, they're very well attuned to adult hypocrisy. I don't know what you all were like as teenagers, but I feel like looking back to my teenage years, I was always on the lookout for adults being hypocrites. And I actually think there's a little bit of a danger if we have these curricula that say, now children, you must never be corrupt, and you must never bribe, and you must never cheat, and you must never break the rules, when the kids are looking around and saying, what are you guys talking about? The adult society I live in is full of that. In that situation, I actually worry, although this is just conjecture, not based on any research evidence, it could be counterproductive, right? The kids are like, this is one more piece of evidence that adults are hypocritical, and when they say follow the rules, they don't really mean it. Which is why, actually, this is not to your question, but I do think it's important for those of us who are in the university setting or the educational setting generally. There's a lot of corruption in universities and in education. Not in all countries. I don't know the situation in Mexico, but many of the countries I study, many of the countries where I work, it's not uncommon for students to give teachers, gifts for help with exams or for grades. It's not at all uncommon for professors, almost always, though maybe not exclusively male professors, to make it clear to certain female students that they expect sexual favors in exchange for grades or advantages, which is absolutely a form of corruption, right? It doesn't matter if the currency is money or someone's body. That's extortion, right? I feel like if we really want to send the message to our students, if we really want to use education and universities to shape students' values, it's all fine and good to have an anti-corruption curriculum, but the first order of business, the first priority, should be to make sure that our actual universities are, to use this language that Susan talked about yesterday, islands of integrity. Right? If the university is not itself an island of integrity, it will be not helpful and maybe even counterproductive if we're offering students course curriculum that say, don't be corrupt. Same thing with secondary education, same thing with primary education. So I'm certainly sympathetic to the idea that it might be helpful if we made more of a concerted effort, especially at young ages, to emphasize an anti-corruption message. I don't think we should fool ourselves that if only we teach people don't be corrupt, we're going to be solving the problem.
I'm not in the academic field, but I'm going to take you up on your offer of where I think academic research can be useful for
Excellent.
civic society. One is the use of technology. We really need to be able to cut through the hype and understand what the technologies can really work in helping fight corruption. We keep hearing about blockchain and artificial intelligence, crowdsourcing, all of this stuff. And it's very easy to be impressed, mostly because we just don't understand it and they use big words. So to the extent that there could be some really solid academic research to say, this really works, this really helps in, follow the money or what have you, I think that would be very useful. And the other thing is, just to kind of emphasize a point you made, is there's a lot of examples of, what worked in Indonesia, what worked in Nigeria, what worked here, what worked there. And there's a big tendency to say, okay, let's adopt it, right? Let's do that here. But something you said is, we need to understand what are the circumstances that made a particular thing work or maybe fail in another jurisdiction, but that could conversely fail or maybe work if it's done properly in our own jurisdiction. So like having a methodology to understand what could make those things work or to identify what are the variables that make things work in particular settings would be very, very helpful. Thank you.
Great. I hope all of you are listening to this, right? Pay attention. Other thoughts, comments, objections?
Mi nombre es María Elena, yo no soy estudiante ni profesor. María Elena, no soy estudiante ni profesor, yo trabajo en el gobierno, vemos este tema todos los días en todos los niveles y me llama la atención que haya clases de anticorrupción. Mi pregunta es, ¿cómo enfocan sus clases? ¿Van más en base a lo que es un derecho natural, el tema de las causas finales, el interés público por encima del interés personal o un interés de grupos? Porque incluso a nivel trabajadores en gobierno, ya no teniendo una relación con empresas, por ejemplo, incluso, repito, entre los mismos trabajadores que estamos ahí, tenemos ciertas actitudes hacia las personas que sí forman parte de nuestro grupo y de las personas que no forman parte de nuestro grupo. Entonces, mi duda es, ¿cómo van enfocadas estas clases anticorrupción y si toman en cuenta este tipo de situaciones?
Great. So in terms of how anti-corruption classes are focused, this is probably a great question because this is a perfect lead-in to, I think, the session we're going to have right after this one or right after the break. There's a piece of your question that relates specifically to your workplace, but let me just put that to the side initially to answer your broader question. What does an anti-corruption class look like? So again, we're about to hear more about alternatives. I would just say it depends a lot on the school or department or the focus of the course. So for example, I have taught courses both at my home institution, the Harvard Law School, and at certain foreign institutions, especially in China, classes on transnational anti-corruption law, things like the US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, to audiences principally of law students. For those classes, our focus is mainly on law. Again, I spend usually the first class just kind of describing the law and how it works, but we spend a lot more of our time thinking about how is it enforced, controversies about what defenses should or shouldn't be available, how these laws might or might not relate to other bodies of law like international human rights law or like international trade law, and broader policy questions. For my friends who are, let's say, development economists who teach classes on corruption, the approach is different. There, the emphasis will be very much on the relationship between corruption and the process of economic development. Because those students are more technically inclined, there will be a lot more emphasis on things like research design for assessing the effect of corruption on various economic outcomes or the reverse, discussions of econometric methods, models, data, and so forth, because for a group of development economists studying the issue, that's what they need to think about. There are people who study this issue in policy schools or political science departments, and there the focus will be more on the government-related issues. There are classes in ethics departments or moral philosophy departments that will think a little bit more about some of these definitional issues that I said are not very interesting, but also broader issues about philosophy or moral theory. So I think it really depends on what you're trying to get across in the class and who your student audience is. It actually relates to another issue that Bonnie and I discussed at that first UN meeting where we had the opportunity to meet one another. I think sometimes when you deal with these well-meaning international organizations that want to promote anti-corruption education, there's not always a sufficient awareness that universities are very diverse. There are different bodies of students at different levels with different interests, and what an anti-corruption course looks like will vary a lot. But, if it's a first-year general education course for 18-year-old freshmen, it will look different than if it's a graduate-level development economics course for third-year PhD students in economics, right? So they just look very, very different. I think that many classes that study corruption as a social phenomenon will want to think broadly about causes, consequences, solutions, right? I think if I were putting together a course that was a general survey course, maybe after the first day where we talk about definitions and concepts, I'd probably have a big chunk of the course thinking about what are the consequences of corruption, how do we know? A big chunk of the course thinking about what are the causes of corruption, how do we know? And then maybe a chunk of the course really building on the causes issue, thinking about what have we learned about potential interventions to solve it. But again, there would be a great deal of variation. And of course, the other dimension of variation is the one that I alluded to earlier on, whether the professor envisions her class as one that's principally an analytical class studying corruption as a social phenomenon, or whether the professor envisions the class as an opportunity to shape students' values and attitudes towards corruption. Maybe a third possibility that might be implied by your question, although I confess I'm not quite sure that's worth mentioning, is many professional schools have ethics classes, which are not about corruption per se, but my students in law school have a required class they take on legal ethics. Now, only a teeny bit of that is on corruption as we conventionally understand it. A lot of it is things like don't mix your clients' accounts with your personal accounts, and don't take on clients when you've represented the same client the opposing client in another matter. But medical schools have medical ethics classes, business schools have business ethics classes, maybe especially in business schools and public policy schools, where the graduates are going on to be business people and government officials, it might be especially important to integrate into those classes ethics components in the same way that lawyers have to learn legal ethics and doctors have to learn medical ethics. I confess I don't know as much as I should about how contemporary business ethics and public policy ethics classes are designed to know whether they do this effectively and whether it gets at the other issues that you raised in your question.
Thank you for the great conference. As I hope future junior academic, in trying to understand how to decrease corruption in procedures within organizations, I'm thinking, okay, I can work with the public sector and think on procedures within the public sector to decrease corruption. Or I can work with the private sector, because there's also procedures within the private sector that are corrupt. And I'm thinking, okay, I have the incentive to publish papers. And it might be easier to work with the private sector because it might be faster. But I'm thinking, to what extent the lessons learned in the procedures in the private sector can translate to the public, and what are the limits to that transfer of knowledge, or if it can be transferred at all. I don't know. I don't know. What are your thoughts on?
It's a very interesting question.